everybody. My name is Steve. I'm going to lecture to you about argument development, creation, or what they called in ancient Rome, argument inventio, the creation of arguments. And I'd like to start off with a quote by Professor Hamblin, who wrote an amazing book in the 1970s called Fallacies. This book, he makes the claim that truth is not enough for something to be persuasive. That is not a necessary condition for persuasion. What is a necessary condition for persuasion is the appearance of truth as such. So what that means is that the form of your argument is at least as important and possibly more important than the quality of the facts or even the presence of agreed upon facts, universally agreed upon facts for your audience. So that's sort of the starting point for today. It's a universal question, and a question you might have dealt with many times, like, well, here's the topic, how do I come up with what to say? That's what we're going to talk about today. How to build that, how to develop that, how to put that together. So I've divided the talk into two sections. What to do if you want to advance a claim, that is, generate an argument out of nothing and advance a position on a topic for a particular audience, or if you want to refute or respond to another person's claims, and how to develop those arguments, how to create those arguments. So those are the two things. I'm going to be giving you some methods, some procedures, some things to do about both of those. And I'll throw some examples in when relevant. And at the end, I have a long list of examples that you can work on and try to do some of the things that I talk about over the next half an hour or so to improve your argumentative brilliance. I know you're already pretty argumentatively brilliant, so it's good improvement. It's not that you're bad, it's just you could be a little bit more brilliant. Just a little. Okay, so we'll start with the idea of what to do when you want to advance a claim. The only place to start, and the best place to start, is with your audience. Who is it who's judging you? Who is it who you're calling upon making a decision? Who is the person who you are reaching out to make a call on the question? What is their culture? What are their beliefs? What are the things that they stand for? What are the things that they think are true? The questions you want to ask about your audience whenever generating argumentation is, what do they accept? What do they know? What do they believe, value, and think? In the debate community, this is a relatively narrow question. Most people involved in debate think the same way politically and culturally. They're from the same place. Not a lot of people get the opportunity to travel all over the world and debate in vastly different communities. But this is a good place to start. Another way you can broaden this is to think about who is affected by the topic that you are talking about. And we call these people the stakeholders. Who are the stakeholders? Who are the people who are going to be affected by this decision? Who are the people who are being affected now by the motion? Who are they? Why are they important? Why are they valuable? What would they say about this? And how would they say it to that judging audience? So if the motion calls for us to make a legal decision, we might want to say, from the perspective of these particular people, this is a great decision because of the reasons. So putting yourself in the position of other people is a really good way to start. When you are generating these arguments, you want to leave a little bit of room in there for people to somewhat disagree with you. And that's kind of a weird concept. Actually, maybe I'll talk about that more at the end, but let's get some basic argument structure going. Some of you may have heard about, when you're advancing arguments, about Aristotle and the syllogism, which is a classical argumentative mode. You probably studied it in university or in high school. You might have studied the syllogism. The syllogism is not that useful when you're dealing with dynamic human audiences who change their mind about things or who judge based on sort of common sense or what they believe the world to consist of. More important than that is the rhetorical syllogism, what we call the enthymeme. This is the basic argument structure that we're going to start with. It is an enthymeme. What is an enthymeme? An enthymeme is like a syllogism in that it has parts to it that draw a conclusion, but you allow the audience or the judge to come to that conclusion themselves. So, for example, instead of saying, the United States is a very wealthy country, people who want to immigrate always want to improve their station in life, therefore immigrants are going to move to the United States because they want to improve their station in life. Instead of a very pedantic and sort of straightforward argument like that, you might make the argument a little bit more open, a little bit more audience participatory in the rhetorical entity by basing it on something they already know, which is that the U.S. is a wealthy country. You don't really need to prove that. The audience is going to kind of accept that as a given. So you can use it stylistically to generate a really nice, compelling argument, such as, immigrants are always looking to improve their station in life. That's why the U.S. has huge immigration problems. That's why the EU has a huge immigration problem, because these countries are places where people can improve their life significantly. Now you notice in that example I sort of left out the wealthy part. The reason why is it's something that the audience can fill in naturally, and it saves me a little bit of time in my speech, and also makes my argument more compelling. I don't sound so much like a robot, or someone who's just listing facts. I'm trying to engage a little bit more with the audience. So that's one of the structures that you can start with. It's a very simple structure, and maybe not the best one. When you're generating these things, the other model that people often use is the Toolman model, but that model is not so useful for the creation of argument. I like to think of a different way of sort of using the Toolman terms, which you've probably heard already, which would be information, claim, and then the connection between the information and the claim, which they call a warrant. You might want to think about adding your claim, which is probably more the argument, what it is you want to advance, and then some kind of proof that supports it. And that's really all an argument needs. This part is where you bring in the value added. What is it that you bring to the table? Are you the only person who can connect these things for the audience? Or are you the person who has discovered the link here? Or are you the person who's just pointing out an obvious truth that either time or culture or circumstances have made the audience forget about those things? So how do we create these structures when we're debating? Well, the best thing you can do to work on this structure when you're creating arguments is to know a little bit about what good governments do. What do we mean when we say good governments? Well, good governments are those governments that people like to live under, that they find a positive and nice experience living there. The governments that people don't flee from, governments that people want to stay under. These kind of countries have these type of governments. But this changes all the time. Sometimes a good government goes really bad. Sometimes there's a revolution and a country's government is deposed and replaced with one that's better or worse. So it's something that's always changing, but there are certain countries that have stability, and there are also the countries that probably have strict immigration laws or strict immigration procedures to follow. These countries you want to study very carefully because they're where you're going to come up with principles that you're going to use to create these arguments. Principles are rules or values that we would never want to abandon, because if we did, the politics of the abandonment of that principle would be incredibly harmful. So for example, lots of governments believe in the principle of self-determination or the principle of free speech, free expression. Many governments in the world have some protection of their citizens of this. If we gave up that principle, we would have many more totalitarian states. We would have governments where the economy would collapse because people wouldn't want to work, they wouldn't want to produce things because they don't feel like they're getting anything out of it. Lots of different reasons why those things would be bad to give up. Or the principle of not interfering in business. Lots of governments have rules about how much the government can intervene in business creation or the regulation of business. And different governments have a different level of law that they generate on that question. You can derive what their principle of government interference in business is by looking at the law and then sort of inductively yourself going from the small example to the greater say, that government's or that people or that government's principle must be that high interference in business is bad. Why would it be bad? And then you can generate lots of reasons for this. This is important because most of the proof for the claims that we do in BP debating doesn't come from statistics or facts, but comes from the world around us that your audience and the stakeholders are going to have perception on. They're going to have a perception on what's real, what's out there, and what's possible. And that perception is going to be what motivates them to believe what they believe. And it's also going to be the way they act on reality, within reality. It's going to create effects that are either harmful or helpful to the motion. So you really need to learn about what these principles of good government are and why we want to uphold them, because these things become the explanation as to why that claim would be good. And they also explain that proof. So your claim might be government interference in business creation, incredibly bad. We can see proof to this to the country of whatever, and whatever stand, okay. So this country, you saw the example of incredible government interference in business, incredibly high taxation, incredibly rigorous laws about creating a business, collapsed their economy, created huge refugee problems for their neighbors, destroyed their country, totally imploded. We don't want to have too much regulation on businesses. We don't have a heavy hand of government in those businesses. So if you knew something about this country, I just sort of made that one up because I don't really know any off the top of my head here. It's kind of late. I'm doing this lecture, maybe not as prepared as I should have been, which you wouldn't do. I know you. You're good students. We can say that those principles come from the evidence around us of what those governments do. So a collection, the first thing I would say if you're going to make sense, a collection of what the principles of good governments do help you generate huge, really, really good arguments, generate and explain those arguments. Okay. So one of the things all arguments need is proof. We'll go into a little bit more detail on proof. How do we prove things? And this applies to sort of both of them. If you're advancing larger claims in the debate, like this would be a good idea, this would be a bad idea, whatever those larger claims you're advancing in the debate, the proof for whether those things are going to work or not, you have to generate. What are some sources of proof that we can come up with? Well, we can do it through reasons, things that the audience would accept as reasonable, or things that they would believe as to how the world functions normally. You can do it through examples. These are things that the audience might not be that familiar with but would recognize, but that you need to explain. So the difference between a reason and an example is an example brings in some event the audience might be somewhat familiar with, but they don't know all the details. So for example, the audience might be somewhat familiar with trade regulations, what the WTO does and what its function is, but they might not know the specifics of how the WTO acts in a particular case that you're debating on. So you would want to use that example, but you need to explain it a lot more than you would a reason. A reason is something that an audience would generally accept very little because it's from their cultural milieu, or it's from their own beliefs or their own perspective or whatnot. Through evidence, now this would be even further afield from an example. Evidence would be the testimony of experts, the presence of certain empirical conditions in the world. So for example, the evidence might be that we know that the majority of people in the world live on less than $1 US a day. That comes from the World Bank, we might say. Now, I don't know if that's true or not. I think that's a true statement, but I don't know where it comes from. But in the evidence, when you use evidence, you cite something like that and say it comes from an external source, but the audience has to believe that source to be credible, valuable, and useful in some way. Now we get a little bit broader when we're looking for proof. Through analogy. An analogy is a situation that has little in common with your argument on the factual or empirical level, but has a lot in common on a lateral level. That is, you're moving analogously to a situation like in a school to the situation in global politics, or the situation in global politics is very much like farming, something like that. So an analogy moves from a situation the audience might be much, much more familiar with into and brings that relationship over into the situation they're less familiar with. So this is great when you're dealing with things like economic motions or motions about geopolitical affairs that you don't think the judges or maybe the people in the debate know a lot about. You can really take it to your advantage to use an analogy that everyone accepts and is very familiar with as the grounding for your arguments about something much more complicated. This gives you control of the rhetoric of the debate, which is incredibly important to maintain. Everyone will jump on that analogy because it's much easier to understand and explain than it is the intricacies of the euro and how the interest rate on government bonds in the Eurozone is calculated. You might say, well, it's very much like the way grades are distributed in a university. Now, if you can make that analogy work, you're really onto something, because the other speakers in the debate will take it over, and you get a huge advantage from them using your terminology and your approach to that argument. And analogies you can just sort of make up, which are great, as long as the connections are persuasive and they hold true and they advance the debate. I think they work wonderfully. to prove your point. Then through metaphor. Metaphor is like analogy, but even broader. So it's a comparison between the situations are similar, but the sources are very, very different. So this would be like when we say the government should act as a father, the citizens are the children, or a good general is a lion on the battlefield. This kind of stuff shows a comparison between the sphere of proper activity, but through things that we wouldn't normally associate at all. So metaphors are considered very artistic, but they're also incredibly powerful. Some of the most powerful speeches in human history use rivers and the idea of torrential water as a metaphor for political change or for the desire for political change. Okay, so those are some ways you can generate proof here to prove your point. So you could say, education is the most important thing to any good government. We see that in the example of the British education system, or the French education system, or the German education system, or the Canadian education system. Then you share your knowledge with that. Then you have to explain why that proves that it's important. You say, we can see through the example of the way Canada does higher education that this is the most important principle to them. Why? Because we see it here in this testimony or through these examples, etc., etc., etc. So that's how you generate an argument. And there's many different ways you can do it, but the most important is to know research and always be researching what different governments do in relation to the big questions governments have to face. The economy, education, social services, the police, the military, things like that. Never mind. So the big questions. What do these governments do in the cases of education, economics, energy, the military, monetary policy, business law, all these kind of things. Very important to know. And it's good to have a collection. You might even want to have a notebook or a document on your computer where you have all this information. You try to get as many examples as you can, because there are a lot of countries in the world and they all address these things very differently, and they have mixed results. The trick is most every country's example can be used to prove a myriad of different perspectives on principle. So it's not good to think of them as locked into one thing, but that they can be many different things. Okay, so how do we structure an argument? Now that we have all this good information here, I'm going to erase some of this with my handy eraser. Man, that is not good. I'm sure there's probably something in this that is not meant to touch skin, but this is the kind of sacrifice I make for you people. I hope you appreciate it. Okay, so the structure of an argument. You must directly state it to the audience you're talking to. Directly state it to the audience. 2, explain what you mean. This is the part that most people forget. You have to explain what it is you mean. Then you offer your proof, which is what we were just talking about. Then the other part, and this is the most important part of any argument you advance in a debate, is you tell the audience what to do with that argument. What does it mean that you've advanced this argument? Does it mean you win a particular point? Does it mean that you win the entire debate? Does it mean that you've won a significant portion of the controversy? What does it mean? What does that argument mean? Always explain this when you're advancing your argument. And this will also get you to explain the argument in a new way in the terms of the strategy of the debate. Very, very important. Lots of people don't do this. It's a real missing element. It can help you win very close debates if you explain exactly what your argument means for the purpose of the debate that you're in and the context of the arguments happening on the table. This right here is an important element to second half debates, for sure, to where they might forget to frame the argument in terms of how it's working with the other things that have been said during the debate and on the table. So always make sure you do that. Very, very important. Okay, when we go to refutation, one of the things that I'd like to point out is a lot of people think that all argument development should be thought of as refutation. So what they mean by that is when you're structuring an argument, you would imagine in your head what smart opponents would say against the motion, and then you just respond. I don't know if that's the best way to approach creating arguments, but It certainly is a good way to do, I mean, it's exactly what you do in refutation. It's a good way to generate arguments, but it does lower some of the creativity factor, perhaps, and some of the interesting way you can develop certain arguments in the course of the debate. But some people approach it that way. If you're new, you might want to approach it that way when you're advancing, when you're writing arguments for your case. You might say, well, what would they say and how do we respond to it? And then you generate positive, advancing argumentation from that by itself. And see how that goes. Sorry, something flew into my eye. I wonder how much of this I'm going to edit. If you're seeing this, I didn't edit very much. Okay, so how do we refute? There are several incredibly important ways to refute. The most basic is sort of the four-step refutation process that people teach. And I'll do that very quickly now because I'm pretty sure you might already know it. First, identify the argument that you're responding to. What was it called? What's the argument that you're responding to on the other side? They advance the argument that education is the most important thing to good governance. So that identifies where you're going to the audience, what you're responding to. Second is what's wrong with that argument. So that's when you say, they're wrong about this because, and then you give your reasons. This is exactly like the creation of an argument. The next step is when you prove why they're wrong. This is where you offer your proof in whatever form you want to do it. A counterexample. You can disconnect their analogy, say it's not close enough, say their metaphor is too broad, too ridiculous. Their examples are not enough. Their evidence is not from the right kind of expert. There are lots of ways that you can take the argument apart, but any of these things, even though they look like a taking away of the argument on the other side, are actually the generation of arguments for your side through refutation. Right? It seems a little complicated, but think of it like this. If I'm saying that they're wrong about this, and their principle falls, or the reason they're winning the debate falls, what I'm saying is I also have to say my argument is good, or these are reasons to support us. Right? So you're sort of generating arguments through refutation as well. So you have to prove what's wrong with it. And then the last thing is then you have to, exactly the same as when you create the argument, you have to say, what does it mean? What do we do with this? What does it mean for the debate? What does it mean for the argument? What does it mean for all that? So if we're arguing on the education point, you could say, they said that education is the most important principle for a good government. We think that that's false. The reason why is multiple examples of great governments show that they don't really give much care at all for education, like the United States. Like other Western European countries, they don't really fund it properly. They don't give it the proper support. And even when they do, it's sort of mishandled because the economy comes first. Now, what does this mean for the terms of this debate? It means that our principle that a sound economic policy helps education more than the government putting education first is proven true through these counter-examples. It also means that their entire case falls. So something like that generates a positive argument for you. It also shows what's wrong with the other side's argumentation. It's a good way to generate why, the thesis that you're sort of generating at that point is, why are they wrong? And you're answering that question in rebuttal. So that's the basic format. Now, let's talk about something a little bit more advanced here. Different advanced ways that you can deal with argumentation and generate and extend more complicated argumentation when you're dealing with opponents. The first is the idea of presence. In any debate, there are a number of arguments on the table, a number of things people have said, a number of bits of information. You want to bring presence to your argumentation and bring it much more forward into the camera of the argument, like I'm doing with the pen here, than everything else. If I step back and do like this, I bring presence to the board. You can do the same thing with your words and the way you address things. So presence in argumentation means you either through time or situation or context or quality, those would be the four ways to sort of do it. That's how you bring presence to yours. Time. Ours is more timely, it's more recent, it's more current, or it's more appropriate for what we're talking about time-wise. Theirs is either outdated or it's too new, it's unproven. All these qualifications on time for their argument. It's not old enough. These are the ways to bring and say our argument is much more presence than theirs. Situation. Given the specifics of the situation we're talking about, our argument is much more present than theirs. Our argument should be center stage. Theirs is on a side stage or maybe even backstage. Context. Not the situation is more like what's happening, who the players are, the geography. Context is like the culture, what the world thinks, the other events that are going on around that event or around that. So if we're talking about education policy, you could say we can't understand education policy outside the context of the particular regime in France who's in charge right now, the party that's in charge, or the other issues that are going on in Europe and how they're being debated and considered color the education debate in serious ways. Or quality. We have better sources, we have better information. It's more broad, it's more robust. A lot of debaters only take information from economists. This is a huge problem. Economics is a great liberal art. It says a lot of things, but it also strips bare a lot of examples of robustness of situations in order to make the claims that it does. Economics is interesting, it's very persuasive, but it's not the whole story. It strips a lot of the extra elements out in order to make the economic analysis work. It strips a lot of humanity out of the situation. So you can always critique things on that and bring presence to arguments that come from much more politically robust analysis. So that's just a big pet peeve and big flaw I think most debaters make, is the purely economic example, which can be considered low quality. It can be considered poor context, poor situation, and not timely as well. So that's presence, and that's a good thing to work on in practice. Much more complicated than that is the idea of dissociative argumentation. Dissociative argumentation is when you take a category of one thing and you split it into two separate things. So for example, with the current stuff going on in the Gaza Strip with Israel, several people have put on my Facebook wall things like Netanyahu, Benjamin Netanyahu, who's the Prime Minister of Israel, is a terrorist, or he's no better than a terrorist. Now, how do we dissociate this claim? What can we do? Well, we can find elements of being a terrorist that are very different and distinct from elements of being the Prime Minister of a country. So one of the ways we could disassociate Benjamin Netanyahu from a terrorist is to say, well, his actions might be violent, but he's not a terrorist because he's democratically elected and beholden to the people. They can always vote him out of office through a parliamentary election. They can always demand that. A terrorist has no such accountability. Secondly, a terrorist doesn't represent any kind of organized state, has no people to defend, has no kind of political structure to defend. Netanyahu has all these responsibilities. He's also recognized by other countries' leaders and populations as a legitimate political actor, whereas terrorists are not recognized as legitimate political actors. They're recognized as criminals by some governments, and others might recognize them as heroes, but it's inconsistent. And that's a huge difference. So it's about peeling things apart that are associated. You can disassociate, or you can be dissociative or disassociate them. You do that by looking at the specifics of each category. So if somebody says an economic policy, or joining the euro is always bad for the country's economy, you can dissociate that and say, well, the euro is not bad for their economy. Look at how their economy was before. It may have been in reverse. So you can dissociate those things, pull them apart, go into the specifics of each category and separate the definition. It's a really good strategy to try to use. So the question for that is, how do I distinguish an individual from a group? How do I distinguish a group from a number of other groups? How do I dissociate a person from a population or from a nationality? And that's a really, really good thing to be able to do in debating. Finally, a very old argumentative form is what they call the appearance-reality pair. And I'll make a diagram here. So in the book, The New Rhetoric, Chaim Perlman and Lucy Obrecht-Stidicka argue that this format is the oldest argumentative format that you can have. And the reason I draw it like a fraction, like a sum here, is because on the top is the appearance. This is what the surface is. And then underneath it is a more deep-set reality. So the way this argument works is you say, they've only got the appearance, but we have the reality. Right? You can also do that with most anything. You can put whatever your opponent says up here, and then what's really going on with your argument underneath. As appearance reality. Appearance reality pairing is very powerful. It's like they have the form of the argument, but we have the truth of the argument. Or they have the figures of the argument, but we have the human cost of the argument. They have the law, but we have the moral obligation. So whatever they put on top at the top is just a shell of something deeper and more complex going on underneath it. You can play with that and try to generate appearance-reality pairs for lots of different things. If you're interested in looking at it in more depth, I suggest looking at the book, The New Rhetoric, by Perlman and Ulbricht-Stedeka. It's really good. They're the ones who sort of invented that. So you always say our opponent's arguments are the terms of the surface, ours are in the terms of the depth. Right? That's an appearance-reality pair. So you might say, they appear to be terrorists, but when we look deeper, they are merely political activists. They are soulful political activists that we really need to be supporting. That's sort of an argument. Okay, so here's some examples you can work through, and I don't know how your instructors are going to deal with this, or maybe you can work through them yourself, but I'll say them, and then maybe you can work on them yourself and think about them a bit. These are all from Facebook and from current political situations. The first one. For someone to be a human shield, someone has to agree to shoot at that shield. For someone to be a human shield, someone has to agree to shoot at that shield. How would we advance that argument if we wanted to make it? How would we refute that argument if we wanted to defeat it or take it apart? And I guess I'll add now, even though it's sort of the example exercise period, that good arguments are defeasible arguments. Defeasibility means an argument can be beat. Bad arguments are arguments that are totalizing and eliminate all possibility of response. So that might be counterintuitive because you think, well, I want to make an argument that has no possibility of response. It's so powerful, no one can think of a response to it. Well, that sort of kills your ability to further your argument, because when the other side responds, then you can further generate other reasons, other examples, and other proof as to why your argument is a really good one. So always think in terms of your argument being defeasible. Don't try to make arguments limited, small, and unrefutable. Try to make them big advocacies that do have another side to them, but that you've developed really well, proven really well, and really shown that they can be, they're persuasive and they're the right thing to do, even though that there's opposition to those things. Okay, here's another example that we've already talked about a little bit. Benjamin Netanyahu has proven himself to be no better than a terrorist. So that's one to work on. Here's a quote from, or an English version quote of the President of Russia, Vladimir Putin. If a disaster occurs over a country's territory, it is only natural to hold the government of that territory responsible. How would we advance that argument? How would we defeat that argument if we wanted to? Another one. Malaysian Airlines Flight 17 was brought down by Russian armed insurgents. And that's really a question of fact, isn't it? Researched fact. But given that we don't know that yet, we can still advance that argument, can't we? We can still respond to that argument. We can say there's not enough evidence, and the people advancing it can say there's plenty of evidence. Just look at the situation, look at what we knew was going on in Ukraine, that sort of thing. And then a final one, Putin is responsible for the current crisis in Ukraine. How would we refute that? How would we advance that? So work on both sides of those, and I think you'll find that you can generate a number of good arguments using some of these techniques, some of these ideas that we've covered, and you might be able to improve your argumentative style, ability, whatever. So feel free to leave me a comment here or email me. I'm sure that your instructor, people at the camp have my email or my Facebook. We can talk further about this, and I wish you the best in debating. Good luck. I hope you win a lot. Bye for now.